Great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks to Asia Society for hosting this. Thanks to all of you for being here and braving the weather to get here. I really appreciate it. Glad to have this opportunity to talk about our most recent international survey that we conducted at the Pew Research Center. And always very happy to talk about this topic of America's global image. We look at a lot of different topics in our international survey work at Pew, but this is the one we've examined most consistently over the years, since the first Global Attitude Survey that we conducted back in 2002. And as you can imagine, over that decade and a half, we've seen a lot of changes, and we certainly see a lot of changes this year. So what I'll do is I'll walk through some slides that highlight some of the key findings from our survey, and then happy to take questions after that about the survey or about how we go about doing this kind of work at Pew. So let me start off by just first telling you briefly a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We're basically a think tank based in Washington. We've been around over 20 years now. As it says here, we're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust. You give us the money, you get to name the place, right? So that's where the name comes from. We do get funding from other sources, foundations like the Gates Foundation, etc. as well. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy, so we don't take positions on policy. We don't make policy recommendations or things like that that a lot of other think tanks do. We actually like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank because we put such an emphasis on facts, data, empirical research, information, and again that distinguishes us, I think, a little bit from other think tanks who are more focused on policy recommendations. You can see some of the research topics we examine listed here. We look at things both in the United States and around the world. I'll put a plug in for the website while I'm here, pewresearch.org. All our reports are there, things like op-eds and blog posts. We have a lot of interactive features, including one that's tied to this report. And the raw data is there as well. If any of you are number crunchers or you have colleagues who are, you can download the data yourself and use it in your own analysis. In terms of the methodology for this survey, it was conducted in 37 countries around the world, and I'll show you those countries. Oh, sorry, in just a moment. Fast forwarded too much there, I guess. We interviewed more than 40,000 people. In most countries, we conduct a face-to-face interview with respondents. In a few places, it's a telephone survey. These are all nationally representative samples, so what that means is that the people in our samples reflect the demographic profile of a country in terms of age, gender, education, income, etc. So, again, the people in the sample, it looks like the country's population. You can see the margin of sampling error there. Pretty typical for these types of nationally representative samples. And again, during Q&A, happy to talk more about how we do this kind of work. Here's the 37 countries. Every year there are countries we'd like to have but don't have. As you can see, we actually don't have China in this year's survey, although we have in the past, and I think we'll have China again soon in our surveys. But we try to get a pretty good representation of countries from regions around the world, as best we can. The two most fundamental measures in this survey are probably these two. There's a question we ask about confidence in the U.S. president. How much confidence do you have in this person to do the right thing in world affairs? We've asked about a lot of world leaders, and we've asked now about 3 different American presidents. And then U.S. favorability, which we and others have used as kind of a baseline measure of how the world sees the U.S. Very simple question. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the United States? So what we find this year is that there's been a big change in how the world sees the U.S. president. So across the 37 countries we surveyed, a median of 64% said they had confidence in President Obama during the last couple of years of his presidency. That's down to 22% this year for President Trump. And as you can see, if you look over here on the left, the percentage of people with no confidence across these 37 countries has gone up substantially. And then if you look over to the right side here, you can see that this change in who's in the White House has also had a big impact on how the world rates the United States. So across these 37 countries, last couple of years of the Obama era, 64% had a favorable opinion of the U.S. then. It's down to 49% now. The unfavorable numbers have come up substantially. So, again, this sort of summarizes, I think, the overall key finding of the study, which is that there's been a major change in how the world sees the U.S. president, and that has in turn had a big impact on how they think about the United States. Now, if you take this confidence measure and look at it a little bit country by country, you can see some big changes. There's a significant difference in just about every country between how people rated Obama at the end of his presidency and how they rate Trump today. So if you look at Sweden, for example, that's where we see the biggest difference. 93% last year in Sweden, when we surveyed there, said they had confidence in President Obama. It's down to 10% for President Trump. You can't get a whole lot bigger difference in a survey than that. It's a huge, huge change. And then if you look down through the list a little bit, you can see that in a lot of European countries there's been a big change. Also in places like South Korea, Canada, Australia, Japan. It's actually in a lot of places that are America's closest allies where we see the biggest differences in how they view Trump today versus how they saw President Obama a year ago. Now, there are two places where Trump gets better ratings than Obama got, Israel and Russia. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen here, you can see Russia. Lots of talk, obviously, about Trump and Russia right now in the news. Israel is a place where there's he gets a little bit better ratings than Obama got, but Russia is really where you see the biggest difference. Ratings for Obama and for the U.S. as a whole had turned much more negative in Russia after the start of the Ukraine crisis a few years ago. He was at just 11% when he left office, but 53% now, a much higher number, say they have confidence in Trump in Russia. And Russia's an outlier in other places, too, that we'll see later on. Here's that same measure, this time taking the timeline back a little more to the Bush era in 4 Western European countries that we've surveyed almost every year over the last decade and a half or so. So as you can see for President Bush, he starts out his presidency getting, not so great ratings in Western Europe, basically. As you probably know, key elements of his foreign policy were very unpopular in the region. His ratings go down over time. By the time he leaves office in 2008, he's getting very low ratings. President Obama comes into office in 2009, and his ratings are just, really positive, right? Almost off the charts. More than 90% had confidence in him in Germany and France in 2009. He stays mostly popular over the course of his presidency, although if you look at the Germany number in particular, it goes down a little bit after the Snowden stories emerged, the NSA scandal broke. It turned out we were listening in on the phone calls of Angela Merkel. That didn't help in Germany, but by the time he leaves office again, he's doing pretty well. He's getting pretty good ratings. And then you can see the steep plunge this year when it comes to ratings for Trump in Western Europe. And, one thing that's interesting is the Trump numbers are actually very similar to what Bush got in 2008 in Western Europe. I think the dynamics behind it maybe are a little bit different, although there's some similarities too. But, the numbers themselves are actually pretty close to what Bush received at the end of his time in office. We did ask about other leaders around the world as well. So these are median percentages across the 37 countries we polled. Same question, and you can see Angela Merkel, out of the 4 leaders we tested, is the only one who gets, on balance, positive ratings. So 42% say they have confidence in her across these 37 countries. Just 31% say they lack confidence in her. Now, Xi Jinping, President Putin of Russia, they get, on the whole, negative ratings across these 37 countries that we polled. However, Trump gets the most negative ratings of all, right? So for President Xi, President Putin, they're mostly negative, but not as negative as what we see across these 37 countries in terms of what President Trump gets. Now here's that other question, the favorability measure, country by country this time. If you look at Europe, for example, you can see that views of the U.S. Vary a lot from country to country within the region. So Poles, Hungarians, Italians, the British mostly have positive views right now of the U.S. If you look at places like the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, they're mostly negative, about 6 in 10 saying they have an unfavorable opinion of the U.S. currently. Varies a lot in Asia as well, so mostly positive views of the U.S. in Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea. That's pretty consistent with what we've seen over the last few years. I think Australia is interesting right now. Of course, a close U.S. ally, Australia. The public there is equally divided between people saying they have an unfavorable and favorable opinion of America. Same question in some other regions. Look at the Middle East, Israel. That's pretty similar to what we've seen over the last few years. About 8 in 10 Israelis saying they have a positive view of the U.S. Other countries we surveyed in the region, largely negative in terms of their ratings for the U.S. Again, this is consistent with what we've seen over the years. As you probably know, President Obama came into office really wanting to turn around America's image in the Middle East. He gave a famous speech back in June of 2009 in Cairo to really launch that effort. But we really never saw much of a change in terms of how people in the region saw the U.S. It was mostly negative throughout his presidency. It remains mostly negative now that Trump's in office. Sub-Saharan Africa is a region where the U.S. typically gets very high ratings. And, you saw that during the George W. Bush era when there was a rise in anti-Americanism around much of the world. He was actually still pretty popular in Africa. The U.S. got mostly good ratings there during his presidency. If anything, they were maybe slightly higher during the Obama era. They're down a little bit in some African nations this year, but on the whole, still mostly positive views for the U.S. in Africa. It varies a little bit in Latin America. Mexico stands out as a place where we're seeing very negative views towards the U.S. right now. 94% in Mexico say they oppose Trump's idea of building a wall on the border between the U.S. and Mexico. So that's a place where we've seen some big changes. And you can actually see that on this map here. This map illustrates the amount of change in the share of the public in these countries saying they have a favorable view of the U.S. So red countries are places where the percentage of people with a positive view of the U.S. has gone down. Dark gray is where there hasn't been any significant change. And then blue are places where U.S. image has actually improved. Now, there are only 2 blue countries on the map. One is Vietnam. And I wouldn't make too much of that. The U.S. has gone from 78% favorable to 84% favorable. So it's gone from, already really positive to slightly more positive. And then the other, obviously, is Russia. Again, the outlier here in this survey. There it's gone from, I believe, 15% favorable to 41% favorable. So, there you've seen a big shift in terms of people now saying they actually have a better view of the U.S. than they did the last time we polled there back in 2015. Lots of red elsewhere. The darkest red is Mexico. Again, that's where we've seen a big change. 66% favorable towards the U.S. when we surveyed there in 2015, 30% now. So you've seen a big, big change in Mexico. That's the biggest on the survey, although obviously ratings for the U.S. are down in many, many other places as well. So we wanted to understand better, how does the world think about President Trump? So we asked some questions both about some of his policies and some questions about his personal characteristics. So in terms of policies, we asked about 5 of the things that he's talked about. Pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, putting tighter restrictions on people from certain majority Muslim countries from entering the U.S., withdrawing from trade and climate agreements, and building the wall on the border with Mexico. And again, these are median percentages across the 37 countries we polled. So as you can see, there's substantial opposition to all of these policies across the countries we surveyed. There are pockets of support for some of these. You know, if you look at the question about putting tighter restrictions on people from largely Muslim countries coming into the U.S., you get majority saying they like that idea in places like Poland and Hungary. The Iran nuclear deal meets with less disapproval, in some, or pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal meets with less disapproval in some of these other policies, although on balance people still say they disapprove of it. You get majority support for that in Israel and Jordan, though, so you have a little bit more support for it in some places. But by and large, we see a lot of opposition to some key elements of Trump's foreign policy. And to me, this illustrates the fact, if you look across these questions, you see opposition to the idea of the U.S. sort of pulling back from international commitments, in opposition to the U.S. putting up barriers, whether it's a literal wall or barriers to entry between itself and other countries around the world. Now, in terms of the personal characteristics of Trump, we tested a number of both positive and negative characteristics. So we read them, this list of things here, and we said for each one of these, tell me whether this is something you think describes President Trump or not. So when we read them, the negative traits, people tended to say, yes, I think this is something that describes Trump. So people tend to say he's arrogant, they tend to say he's intolerant, they tend to say he's dangerous. Not many people say that he cares about other people or that he's well qualified. He gets slightly better marks on being charismatic. And then the one positive trait that people tend to associate with him is that he's a strong leader. And you see that even in some places where he's not very well regarded. So, for instance, in France, I believe it's 54% say, yes, he's a strong leader. Only 14% say they have confidence in him. So even in some places where he's not popular, you do see him getting pretty high marks on this question about being a strong leader. Now, something we've liked to track over time are different elements or attitudes towards different elements of what we might think of as American soft power. And we did that again this year. We do see some changes. We see some declines in certain elements of American soft power. But overall, the pattern looks a lot like what we've seen over time. So, for example, when you ask about the American people get generally pretty high ratings around the world. So a median across these 37 countries of 58% say we have a favorable opinion about the American people. American popular culture tends to do pretty well. So a median of 65% say they like American movies and television and music. The U.S. gets pretty good marks for respecting the personal freedoms of its people. Now, that's a question that's come down a little bit over time, especially after the NSA story broke. But, by and large, you still see people around the world saying, I think the U.S. government essentially respects the individual liberty of its citizens. American ideas about democracy, publics around the world tend to be split on that. And again, that's actually pretty consistent with what we've seen over time. And then the one question where we consistently see people saying essentially they don't like this aspect of American soft power is this question about U.S. ideas and customs spreading to your country. Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? And people tend to say they think it's a bad thing, which I always think is interesting if you look at that question beside the culture, pop culture question. People on the one hand, they want American entertainment, right? They want their superhero movies and their Jay-Z or Taylor Swift or whatever it is, right? But they also worry about American culture sort of pushing out their own culture. They want to consume American culture, but they want to do it on their own terms to some extent. And I think it represents the kind of push and pull and attraction and repulsion that people feel about the U.S. At different times. Another area we wanted to explore is whether people think things are going to get better or worse in terms of their country's relationship with the U.S. So we asked people, now that Trump is president, do you think things are going to get better, get worse, or stay about the same in terms of your country's relationship with the U.S.? And outside of Africa, we actually see, not many people saying that things are going to get better, right? You see a pretty good number of people saying that they expect things to get worse in these regions. But also the prevailing view in many places is that things are going to stay about the same, which I think is interesting, given all the negativity that we've seen towards Trump, all the opposition that there is to key elements of his foreign policy. Nonetheless, lots of people are telling us that they don't think things are necessarily going to change a whole lot in terms of their country's relationship with the U.S. And to me, that highlights something that I think we see in this data. I think we've seen it in different ways over time, which is, there's some resiliency or durability in America's image. There's things that people like or value about the U.S. or about their country's relationship with the U.S. that tend to endure even in times where people aren't very happy with an American president or they're not very happy with an administration's foreign policies. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean they think everything is going to change about America or about their country's relationship with America. And then one final topic I wanted to share with you is some questions we asked about views about China around the world and views about the balance of power between the U.S. and China, which is a topic we've looked at a lot over the last few years. We just put out a report about this topic late last week. So, we asked that same basic favorability question that we ask about the United States, we ask it about China. And, if you recall that very first slide I shared with you, what we've seen in these 37 countries in the study is that the median percentage with a favorable opinion of the U.S. has gone down from 64% to 49%. Looking at these same countries over time, we've seen the percentage of people with a favorable opinion of China go down just a little bit, from 50 to 47. So essentially what's happened over the last year or two is that the gap has closed in terms of overall ratings for the U.S. and overall ratings for China around the world. Now, if you look at that favorability measure for China, again, country by country, you can see, again, there are lots of variations among the countries in the study. You look at Europe, Greece, the Dutch, the Brits, on the whole, saying they have a positive view of China, much less so in Germany and Italy, very positive in Russia, big differences across the Asia-Pacific countries we surveyed, very positive towards China and Australia, as well as the Philippines and Indonesia. Negative in South Korea. It's gotten more negative over the last year. And then, extremely negative, the most negative ratings we typically see for China are in Japan and Vietnam. Same question, some other places. You'll see a lot of these numbers don't come close to 100. That's typically because we don't show the people who say they don't have an opinion on these slides. So if you see places where the numbers are pretty low, that's because a lot of people haven't formed an opinion about China, which is something we typically see. People are sort of more able to give an opinion about the United States in some countries than they are about China. But mix of views in the Middle East, mostly positive in sub-Saharan Africa. Just as we saw with the U.S., tends to be true for China as well. China gets some of its highest ratings in sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, a lot of Chinese investment in the region in recent years. In the U.S. press, you'll occasionally read stories about pushback or resentment of Chinese firms in Africa, for not hiring enough local people and things like that. We don't see a lot of that in our public opinion data. China's continued to get pretty good ratings there, so has the U.S. In Latin America, again, a mix of things, a mix of views across the regions in the study. One thing we typically see when it comes to ratings for China as well as for ratings for the United States, is that it's younger people who have a more positive opinion about China, as well as younger people have a more positive opinion about the U.S. Now, another question we ask is about economic power in the world. So, who do you see as the world's leading economic power? We ask respondents this question. We give them 4 options. They can say the U.S., or China, or the European Union, or Japan. Not many people tend to say the EU or Japan. They tend to say it's either the U.S. or China. And overall, in this year's survey, the U.S. gets somewhat higher numbers than China does. And if you look at this map, the blue countries are places where people say the U.S. is the world's leading economic power. Red is where they say China. Dark gray, it's a tie. So, slightly more places say it's the U.S., but you can see a lot of red on the map as well, especially Russia, but also, allies of the U.S. like Canada and Australia, and then a lot of red in Europe, which is a place where we've seen a lot of changes on this question over time, which is what this slide illustrates. So this is the median percentage across 5 European countries we've surveyed every year since 2008. It's France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Britain. So it's the median percentage across those 5 countries saying either the U.S. is the world's leading economic power or that it's China. So if you go back to the first time we asked this question, back in the spring of 2008, that's before the financial crisis really kicked into gear, more people said the U.S. across these 5 countries. As the economic woes kind of linger for a few years in the U.S., the China number goes up, the U.S. number goes down. Then what we see starting in 2012, as the U.S. economy slowly recovers, maybe the Chinese economy starts to grow at a slower rate, the China number comes back down, the U.S. number comes up. We see that all the way through 2016, but then this year the pattern reverses itself again. And we now see more people in Europe by a pretty substantial margin saying that China is the world's top economic power. So, to me, this is something that we'll want to keep tracking over the next few years to look at, not only how the world sees the U.S., but how does the world think about American power in the world? And, does their dislike of Trump lead them to have lower assessments of American power? If Trump's foreign policy sort of emphasizes pulling back the U.S. from international engagement, pulling back the U.S. from international collaboration, does that have an impact on how people see America's power, and how they see America's power vis-a-vis China? So I think there'll be a lot to look at over the next few years to further explore this topic of how the world sees the U.S. and then how does the world think about the balance of power around the world. But I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks. Thank you. Great. Yes. Who's that? Yeah.
So I wanted to know why you excluded China.
Sure. Yeah,
Why you excluded China?
Yeah, we've surveyed China a lot in the past, and obtained data from there. This year, as you probably all know, there's been a change in the regulations involving foreign NGOs and regulations involving survey research. So basically, we've paused. We're trying to see how that may or may not apply to us. But I'm optimistic we're going to be surveyed again very soon, either later this year or early next year in China.
Two quick questions. One is, you use telephone surveys, but a lot of those countries that you use, access to a telephone is highly skewed. So if you do Ghana, if you do Nigeria, if you do Peru, so methodologically, how did you manage that? Mm-hmm. And the second question is changes over time. You started the survey in February, you ended it in May. Mm-hmm. One could argue that, in fact, the president has done, your president, not mine, because I'm Canadian.
We'll ask about Trudeau next time.
Yeah, that that there's been a change over the last 3 months in terms of the negativity as he's stayed in office. So I wonder if you can you must control for that.
Sure, sure. And just to clarify on the mode of the survey, in most countries it's actually a face-to-face survey. So like, Nigeria, places in all of Latin America, most countries it's a face-to-face interview. So we send interviewers all throughout the country and things like that. It's only in a few places that we do the telephone surveys. It's, the U.S., some but not all of Europe, Japan, Australia, South Korea. So, again, in most places, like you said, you wouldn't want to do a phone survey because some people still don't have phones and that kind of thing. And there actually, as you probably know, there's lots of advantages to doing the face-to-face interview. You get higher response rates. You can do a longer interview, all those types of things. So, we like doing that kind of survey where we can. And it's a great point about the field period and the timing. It's always a challenge for any survey, especially one like this, that it's such a big thing to manage and carry out that it takes a while to pull this off in 37 countries around the world. So it's always possible things have changed a bit. If you look at climate, for example, this is before Trump announced that the U.S. is pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So. But if anything, you might think something like that would have led to even more negative views. So what we got in this survey is already pretty negative, but it's possible that for some reason in certain countries they could be even lower now.
Well, there are pretty distinct gaps between countries in the kind of approval, disapproval ratings of Trump, particularly in countries like Israel and Asia. Do you look into the reasons why
in terms
for
of
this divergence in the gap? Why, based on a fixed number of perceptions of U.S., of Trump's character, is the same set, and then why certain countries have a narrower gap between the approval and disapproval ratings, and some countries have a larger divergence? Do you analyze the reasons why?
Yes, I think we have some data that would suggest that. I think that some of the, there are places where opposition to key elements of his foreign policy are stronger. If you look at climate change, for example, that really registers a lot in, say, Europe and Latin America, and it's driving some of the dislike of Trump there. There's certain majority Muslim countries where the travel ban, essentially, is very unpopular. So that's driving opposition there. Building the wall on the border with Mexico is very unpopular in Mexico and in Latin America. So there are certain places where I think the numbers for Trump are being driven down by particularly strong opposition to some of his policies. And I think another reason why you see bigger gaps in some places is there were just parts of the world where Obama's numbers were so high, particularly Europe, where he just consistently throughout his presidency got such big numbers. Now in that region in particular, there's a lot of opposition to Trump's policy. So there's where you see some of the biggest gaps. Again, Sweden, the Netherlands, these places where Obama was really popular. Trump now coming in with sort of a different approach to world affairs, much more negative.
Sure.
Yeah, on Israel, it's actually quite easy because the Israelis disliked Obama greatly. Yeah. They felt that his strategy in Egypt and his opening up to the Middle East was a complete failure. His drawing the red line in Syria, very, very negatives, even probably among moderate Israelis. He had very strong negatives, and at the time of this, Trump was still talking about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, so there were all kinds of positive things that he had said. Give him time, they'll realize that he's not delivering on lots of that, too.
Yeah, that's a good point. In Israel, we saw, Obama's numbers turned much more negative, especially around the time of tensions between Obama and Netanyahu over the Iran nuclear deal. And, Obama got especially low ratings among Likud party supporters in Israel. And we see just the opposite for Trump. Likud party supporters are even more positive about Trump than other Israelis. So there's a partisan difference, too, in Israel in terms of how people see Obama and how they see Trump now.
So I assume when you're conducting the survey, so you would
like try to do it as in a short time? Like you want to do it at the same time in different countries, right? How do you manage to do that? Like, how do you have that kind of resources and manpower to? Because, as you said, like if you ask the question today or tomorrow, it would be a drastic difference. Like, if White House announces another scandals or whatever, it would affect the outcome a lot. So how do you like manage to, what if like you ask the question today in one country, but like because for some reason you have to ask, because for some reason you ask the question later that day, in another country. So
well, nowadays with Twitter, timing is everything, right? So
how do you like manage
one tweet away, right? So
how do you like manage to keep the result as objective as possible?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. As you can imagine, it's not easy to sort of plan this out across all these countries, and we try as hard as we can to have the field period relatively similar across countries. So in most places, it's actually in March and April, and in some places we started in February, and a few places it ended up going into May, but mostly it was around March and April, a relatively consistent period. And the way we do that is we work with lots of firms around the world. So we have basically what we call a coordinating vendor at the regional level who helps us manage this work. And then in each country, we have a field partner who knows how to do this work and does it all the time in those countries. So we essentially did, talked about manpower and capacity. We have to outsource a lot of that, but we, oversee it all at Pew. So we try our best to sort of keep it consistent in terms of the field periods, as best we can around the world. Although, like you said, something can always happen. So we're always holding our breath, right? Getting this data back and writing these reports that the world won't change before we get the data out. And there's always going to be some things, but I think if you look at the types of questions we ask, there shouldn't have been a lot of change since we conducted the survey back in the spring.
Thanks. Is there a way methodologically to control for the relative transparency in the U.S. versus that of China? I can't remember exactly what the time frame was, but the U.S. had come down markedly versus China staying largely the same, whereas we have President Trump tweeting every day. But there's also the fact that last time I checked, there were dozens of violent protests that occur every single day in China that we don't hear about at all. So I'm kind of wondering how you balance that.
Yeah, I think it's a reality you have to take into account that compared to China, compared to any other country, the U.S. is just sort of better known around the world, right? There's especially now when the Trump era, people are talking about Trump. He's tweeting, people are responding to it. American popular culture is better known around the world than popular culture from other countries and things like that. So, there's more information that people have to base their evaluation on when it comes to the U.S. And, I think that's something that there's no way to really control for it in our data. We just have to take into account that people's opinions may change more rapidly about the U.S. because there's more information that they can access about America at any given moment.
Do you increase the number of countries you survey every year? And also, are there any specific countries that you miss surveying this year that your team is actively trying to get involved next year?
Yeah, we do change around the survey countries from time to time. Of course, we'd love to do more. It's just a matter of sort of resources, from year to year in terms of which ones we do. We try to go back to a lot of the same countries year after year because then we have these trends we can examine and see how things change by going back to a lot of the same places over the years. But there are places we'd like to add. As I said, China, we hope to be back in soon. Saudi Arabia is a place we've never surveyed. I think it's maybe the only G20 country we've never surveyed, so we'd like to add that in at some point if we could. But, we kind of make it up as we go along a little bit, depending also what's on the international agenda, what's in the news. We never had Tunisia in the survey until the Arab Spring happened. We didn't have Greece in the survey until the economic crisis hit. So, sometimes things come along which make a country interesting in a variety of ways. We try to include that country in the survey then.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Would you mind if we go back to the slide where we compare different leaders in the world, like Germany and So what kind of context do you give to interviewers about how strong or how confident they are in the leadership? Because if you say how strong is Merkel leading everyone in the European Union, possibly that will be a high percentage. Or how confident are you as her as a world leader? That might be shifting a lot of like different according to circumstances and context.
Yeah, right.
How would you paraphrase it for interviewers like that?
We don't try to give it too much specificity in terms of that question. You know, the way it reads is pretty straightforward. How much confidence do you have in them to do the right thing in world affairs? So it's basically like how much confidence do you have in this leader in foreign policy, kind of writ large, rather than, you know, how's Merkel handling European affairs or that kind of thing, or how a given leader is handling regional affairs. So it's a pretty broad question. But we feel like since we're asking it all around the world, that's probably the best way to do it. So it's a question, you know, there's lots of different ways you could ask, you know, views about a leader, obviously. You can ask whether you have a favorable opinion of them, whether, you know, you approve of how they're handling their job, or you can ask this kind of question about general confidence in them. If anything, this question tends to run a little bit higher than you would get than job approval or favorability or things like that. Is what we've seen over time, because it's really focused on how they handle world affairs rather than maybe other aspects of their job. She's coming there.
So, I was just wondering, because obviously you want your results to be of use, right? It's not just of interest to us. So how significant do you think this is in shaping foreign policy? So I guess it would be different in different administrations, but under the Trump administration, how significant or how much impact do you think Pew Research results have in shaping foreign policy?
Yeah. You know, like I said, we don't take that next step and try to get involved and say, you know, you should do this policy based on our data. But what we hope is that our surveys on this topic or other topics kind of inform the conversation about, you know, foreign policy and America's role in the world affairs. So, you know, we hope that sort of part of the overall discussion. You know, and often I think in terms of this data on how the world sees the U.S., it's about the context in which foreign policy takes place and the context in which policymakers operate. So, you know, if the U.S. is unpopular in a country, you know, it sets up incentives for policymakers in that country to you know, not cooperate with the U.S. Right? It doesn't mean cooperation won't take place, but you could argue that it sets an incentive structure that makes it more difficult for people in a given country to cooperate with the U.S. So I think it's part of the overall context in which policymakers operate. You know, for this report, we've certainly found, you know, there's been a big audience for it. You know, we've been a lot of, you know, things we look at, right, for sort of metrics of success for getting our reports out there. You know, press clips and web traffic and people interested in briefings and all that sort of thing have been very high. So what that tells us is there's an appetite out there for this kind of information. And, you know, again, we don't tell policymakers what they should do with it. We think policymakers are paying attention to it.
One of the questions I have for you is, was there anything that surprised you, like from last year to this year, that anything that's just kind of like, you know, that you weren't expecting?
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are a couple of things that I thought were particularly interesting. I mean, one is just the size of the change. I mean, you know, we weren't surprised that President Trump is less popular than President Obama, but, you know, nonetheless, the size of the difference in some countries is pretty stunning. On the flip side of that, the other thing I thought was, you know, maybe a little surprising in a way was that question I talked about near the end in terms of whether people think things are going to get better or worse or stay the same in terms of relations with the U.S. In there, again, the prevailing view in lots of places is that things are going to stay about the same. So, you know, with all that negativity towards Trump we see, all that opposition to his policies, you might have expected that things are going to get worse number to be higher. But, you know, and people did say that. Some people did say things are going to get worse. But a lot of people say, I think things aren't going to change that much, which, again, to me was interesting and highlighted the fact that, you know, there is that sort of durable quality in terms of how they see the U.S. It doesn't change even when maybe they're upset with the president.
Okay. Other question?
so when I was doing my research, so I of course used your research, and then I found some questions like that appeared in the 2014 survey and did not appear on the 2015 survey. So of course I want to get the most updated result as possible, right? And so I wonder, do you like to try to keep the questions constant, or do you like to want to refine the question because just like the question was not good enough, so you like coin differently? So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, always good to hear that people are using our research and their research. If you have questions about anything in particular, you can follow up with me afterwards. I'd be happy to point you in the direction of anything we've got on our website that would be relevant. In terms of the questions each year, there's some we like to ask every time or almost every time and see how those views have changed. We also like to mix it up a little bit to incorporate new issues that come up. And then some questions, probably we know aren't going to change a lot year to year. So, we don't want a whole survey that shows no change or nothing new. That's, not very, the media is not going to talk about that much, or people aren't going to talk about that much. So, we always try to strike a balance between what we'd call trend questions and then introducing new things each year too. And hopefully it adds up to kind of an interesting story that shows how things have changed over time, but also speaks to issues that have emerged over the last year or so.
David,
Just a comment on your point about people, generally the views being, people thought that things wouldn't change that much. It reminded me of Michael Green's talk here where he was talking about the Trump administration. And his point was that the structure of the international system would just be consistent to constrain Trump. And that may reflect partly that people realize that there's only so much he can do, and maybe that things just will continue. A lot of the trade relations, Europe and particularly Europe, and that it won't change that much. But
yeah, I think that's a good point. There's all these institutional arrangements that aren't going to change overnight, and economic relations that aren't going to change overnight, things like that. And it's interesting that people kind of recognize that, I think, and it's what this survey would suggest.
Bernard?
Yes, picking up that sort of theme. I mean, I thought it was most interesting chart was that Mr. Trump is just about as unpopular as Mr. Bush was, and therefore one wonders, as you've just been saying, that does it make very much difference to the world? The world continues on. But if we were to go back to when you first did this, how popular have presidents been? I mean, what real difference has there been over 20, 30 years of presidents?
Yes. And, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data going back very far on this. At Pew, we first started asking these questions, early in the George W. Bush era. The U.S. State Department has a lot of data on it. The USIA and things like that used to do these surveys during the Cold War a lot. The problem is it's difficult to get that data. So one research project I hope we can do at some point is unearth a lot of that. It's not always easily available. We have referenced some U.S. State Department polling at the end of the Clinton era, and it showed that at the end of his presidency he was getting higher ratings in Europe and other parts of the world. The U.S. was getting higher ratings in much of the world than we saw early on in the Bush presidency. So it did seem to go down a little bit, especially as Bush started to ramp up towards the Iraq War, which of course it generated a lot of opposition around the world. So we've definitely got some data that the downward change during from Clinton to Bush, back up for Obama, and then back down again now for Trump, and hopefully we can extend that timeline backwards more in the future and see what it looks like.
One of the numbers that you said about a lot of people still see him as a strong leader.
Yeah.
That is an interesting, kind of, but still, people are still. In fact, you mentioned was there a poll from Washington Post in terms of numbers? It's still kind of coming down. I mean, and usually trips like what the foreign trips that he had just done with the G20 and all that usually also helps a leader with its poll numbers, but that doesn't seem to have happened. Is that?
Like you said, I haven't looked closely at it, but I do think the Washington Post had a poll out today showing that in the U.S., Trump's approval rating was down to 36%, I believe it was. And you're right. Often the sort of foreign trips can help. Often what you've seen in the past, at least, too, is presidents who domestically were unpopular started spending more and more time out there with the rest of the world, right? Sort of getting out of Washington and out of the U.S. is kind of a strategy. So we'll have to see if Trump pursues that, if his numbers stay low. And like you highlighted, around the world, we do see that strong leader number being, his most positive characteristic by far. Of course, it doesn't mean people always think he uses that strength in a good way, right? Or that necessarily means that they like the way in which he manifests being a strong leader. But it is a trait, at least, they associate with him, as this idea of strength, which is something that, obviously Trump has tried to portray himself as being strong as part of his image that he wants. And some evidence here that at least people around the world, that resonates with them a bit.
Okay. Here.
We were talking about Twitter before, and I just checked Twitter, and this survey is being tweeted about.
Oh, good.
And it says the headline is that China is gaining ground over the United States. And then also it says that Donald Trump is less trusted than Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. And the slides went a little bit too fast. Is that accurate?
Well, what I'd say is that, in terms of the Trump versus Xi Jinping and Putin, is that across these 37 countries, the share of people who say they lack confidence in Trump is higher than the share who say they lack confidence in Putin or Xi Jinping. So that is true. Now, neither Putin or Xi get positive numbers in this survey, but they don't get the numbers for them are not as negative as what you see for Trump. Now, Merkel again is the only one who globally gets more positive than negative ratings. So next year, what we might want to do too is expand that list. You always want to go with leaders who have sort of a high enough profile to be known around a lot of the world. It's actually taken a while for Merkel to get that well known. We used to ask about her several years ago, and a lot of people would say they don't know, but now her profile, I think, has risen over time. So, her numbers are you don't get as many people saying they don't know. Maybe somebody like Macron, would be a candidate to include next year, or, we'll have to think about
Trudeau?
it. Trudeau, or, yeah. So there's some people, we'd like to expand that list a bit.
There's any other questions? Okay, one last one over here.
Hi, I'm Trey. I work for Latin Systems with my ex-colleagues from HSBC. I want to ask you a question about sampling bias, because clearly after the presidential election in 2016, where I told all my traders that, Trump is not going to win, which I was completely wrong, and so was Brexit, and so was the rest of the markets. And then the Pew Research came up with an article saying that there was a sampling bias where highly educated people are more prone to answering the survey. And so therefore, which makes me, obviously the survey reflects what we read in the media, which reflects what highly intelligent people think or feel about tweets. So how do you rectify this sampling bias, which shows, other than the French presidential election, that does happen? So that's the big question I have. And now we in just this big echo chamber, right?
You're right. Yes, well, as I'm sure you know, lots of challenges to pollsters today in the U.S. and all around the world too, right? In terms of getting good samples, things like response rates are much lower than they used to be. That tends to be more of a problem in kind of wealthier nations where we do phone surveys and things like that. But if you look at the polls, and you're right, I've got colleagues who are more the sort of methodologically inclined at Pew, have done a lot of studies on this, particularly in the U.S., and looking at sampling bias and what may or may not have driven issues in the U.S. polling around the presidential campaign. Even in the U.S., the presidential campaign polling was, I think, generally off about 2 percentage points, 2 or 3 points, something like that. So, it wasn't so far off on the popular vote nationally. What was really off were a lot of the state-based polls that didn't call Pennsylvania right and that kind of thing, for example. But what we all try to do is, of course, look at our sample composition. You're right that often it's the more educated who are more likely to respond to these surveys. So what we do is we try to weight the data on the back end to account for that kind of thing. So it's always a challenge, but I think that polls still aren't that far off. They might be missing a close election by if it's down to 1 or 2 points in an election, a poll that's 3 points off might miss it. But certainly if you look at these kind of numbers, these huge differences, these huge changes, I think those kind of things are beyond any kind of sampling error that we might have.
Okay. On that note, we're going to thank Richard for being here. I know we had Charlie Cook here a few months ago and talking about some of the polls being, a lot of them got things wrong last year.
Yeah.
And I'm sure in this age of social media, a lot of things it seems like we're living on, really fast speed. So sometimes the surveys and the polls are, maybe a bit behind. So maybe down the road there will be the surveys done on an app or something. Who knows? So is that something, the technology side of it, is that something that Pew is also looking into?
Yeah.
Perhaps?
So we've built a panel of people to do online surveys with and things like that. There's all kinds of, like you said, how can people use the phone? It's what everybody's got in their hand. It works quickly and
certainly
things like that.
Certainly the president. So.
Yeah, so we some high-profile users of their cell phones these days. A lot of people want to do, for example, in developing countries or emerging nations, text-based surveys. There's still a lot of problems with that, but I think that you're right. What the polling world wants to do is to figure out how to use all this technology and try to move as quickly as the rest of the world's moving. It's not easy, but there's lots of people trying to figure it out right now.
Well, thank you, Richard. Hopefully we'll look forward to having you back next year, and it'll be interesting to see what the survey result will be like next year, a year from now. I feel so much happens in a year, and hopefully the world is still in good shape, and I know Asia Society in Hong Kong will be. So thank you all for being here. And Richard, on behalf of Asia Society, we already gave you the Heritage Review book, so this is our catalog of our latest exhibition, Breathing Space. But thank you for being here.
Thanks so much.